13 of 1 Samuel 15. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed be thou of Yahweh. I have performed the commandment of Yahweh." And Samuel said, "But what meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" And Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to Yahweh thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." And Samuel said unto Saul, "Stay, and I will tell thee what Yahweh hath said to me this night." And he said unto him, "Say on." And Samuel said, "When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and Yahweh anointed thee king over Israel? And Yahweh sent thee on a journey and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of Yahweh, but didst fly upon the spoil, and it's evil in the sight of Yahweh?" And Saul said to Samuel, "Yea, I have obeyed the voice of Yahweh, and I have gone the way which Yahweh sent to me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to Yahweh thy God in Gilgal." And Samuel said, "Hath Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in the obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is the iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of Yahweh, he also rejected thee from being king." And Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned, I have transgressed the command of Yahweh and thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin and turn again with me, that I may worship Yahweh." And Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh hath rejected thee from being king over Israel." And Samuel turned about to go away, and he laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it rent. And Samuel said to him, "Yahweh hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to his neighbor of thine that is better than thou. And also, the strength of Israel will not lie nor repent, for he is not a man that he should repent." Then he said, "I have sinned. Yet honor me now, I pray thee, before the elders of my people, and before Israel, and turn again with me, that I may worship Yahweh thy God." So Samuel turned again after Saul, and Saul worshipped Yahweh. Then said Samuel, "Bring you hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came unto him delicately. And Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." And Samuel said, "As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women." And Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before Yahweh in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house to Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and Yahweh repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. At this time, we'll turn the class over to our brother Stephen.
Thank you, Brother Dan, and good evening, my dear brothers and sisters in our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for the invitation to be with you all this evening. Just a small correction on the title. It's Samuel and Saul Confronting Conversations. So we're going to be looking at a confronting conversation this evening, the one that Brother Dan read for us. This class was actually part of a series that we did recently at the Okanagan Central Ecclesia. So just like to do a little bit of background before we get into the confronting conversation itself, as we have it between Samuel and Saul. We know, do we not, brothers and sisters, that David had many friends throughout his life. He had many supporters whose loyalty was such that they would have given their lives for him. And he also had many enemies. Some were giants. Some led rebellions. Others gathered armies to fight him. Some cursed him bitterly. And others took counsel together how they might destroy him. But there was one man, as it were, amongst David's enemies who stood head and shoulders above every other enemy. And I'd like you to come, please, to 2 Samuel chapter 22, where we have a psalm or a song that is repeated again in Psalm 18. And we read together in 2 Samuel 22, verse 1, these words, where it says, "And David spake unto Yahweh the words of this song in the day that Yahweh had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul." Only one enemy is singled out by name. There's no mention of Goliath. There's no mention of Ishbi-Benob, who just in the previous chapter, chapter 21, almost killed David with a new sword. There's no mention of Shimei, who threw rocks and dust at David. No one but Saul. Just one more verse from this song in chapter 22 and verse 18. David wrote, "God delivered me from my strong enemy and from them that hated me, for they were too strong for me." And that in that verse, we actually have the definition of what an enemy is, of what the word means. It means to hate. And so he says, God has delivered me from them that hated me, the very definition of an enemy. You know, in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 29, it says that Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. It was a daily thing, brothers and sisters. Rotherham says Saul was hostile to David all the days. And you know, it's one thing to face an enemy in a one-time competition or a battle. But it's another thing altogether, is it not, brothers and sisters, when you are in a position of submission to your enemy. Because David's greatest enemy was also his employer. But so much more than that, brothers and sisters, his greatest enemy was also his king. And in addition to that, his greatest enemy was also his father-in-law. What a tangled and intricate web David was put in when he was placed in the very midst of the royal family. From the quiet hills of Bethlehem, God places him into a toxic palace. And it all started out fine for David, didn't it, in that palace? In fact, it almost seemed too good. It seemed too easy. We read, of course, that at the beginning, Saul loved David greatly. I mean, after all, he killed a giant for him, didn't he? David would soothe Saul's bouts of melancholy by singing to him with the harp. We read of David behaving himself wisely in his courts. We read of David successfully fighting battles for him. So how and why was it, brothers and sisters, that Saul would go from one extreme of loving David to the polar opposite of making it his life mission to get rid of him? And the answer is, brothers and sisters, that Saul was acutely selfish to the extreme. It was a selfishness that fed a consuming envy, that created a jealousy built upon insecurity. And that formed a hatred against David, brothers and sisters, that inspired awful things. And everything in Saul's life was viewed through the lens of self. He was a very different man from his own son, Jonathan, who was God-focused, and viewed life through the lens of faith in God. Just in order to try to really see in just a very small snapshot that we'd like to do together, brothers and sisters, just to see the extreme selfishness, that the damage that can have on others. We want to drill down a bit and just look at a couple examples just for the sake of time, just so that we're all on the same page and trying to understand the character and the mind of Saul. What impact did Saul's extreme selfishness have on his family and his leadership as Israel's first king? So first of all, how it affected his family, just as a brief snapshot. His selfishness, brothers and sisters, was so overshadowing that it resulted in having zero regard for the feelings of others, even when it came to his own children. And you know, often it is said, and we've probably experienced it ourselves, perhaps it is us. It is said that fathers have a very protective relationship with their daughters. Well, have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 20. Because we read in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 20, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Why did it please him, brothers and sisters? Was he happy for his daughter? We know the story. That didn't even enter the equation. It wasn't about his daughter's happiness. He was happy, brothers and sisters, because he could use his daughter as a tool in his hand. And he messed with her. And he messed with her love for his own purposes and for his own ends. Verse 21, and Saul said, I will give him her that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in one of the twain. We're told very little about Saul's wife, aren't we? Only enough to be very concerned for her. Well, we can imagine what life would have been like for Jonathan's brothers, Abinadab and Malchishua. We're not given details, are we? But it is different with Jonathan. You know, on both of the occasions that Jonathan acted on the behalf of Israel and for God, and he defeated a garrison of the Philistines, both of those times he was away from Saul because it was better that way. We don't have time to go through 1 Samuel chapter 14, the previous chapter from what we read together. But if you haven't concluded in your own mind that Saul had an agenda in that chapter to get rid of Jonathan, and have a read through it, 1 Samuel chapter 14 in your own time, and see what you think about it. Brother Roy Stiles has an excellent set of notes on Saul and Jonathan. That's very revealing of Saul's true character. Just a couple of quotes from those notes. He said, Saul had almost as much jealousy over Jonathan as he does David, because Jonathan was the man that Saul could never be. Saul rushes in to take over what God and Jonathan had already done, because Saul needs to be seen as the victor. And he raises the question too, why did Jonathan not go against Goliath? And he raises the point, and I think it's a very good one when you stop and think about it, brothers and sisters, and what life was like for Jonathan. He didn't go against Goliath when he had the faith to, because he knows his dad can't handle it. And it's better for him, it's better for Jonathan if he doesn't even go there. Saul was prepared to kill his son on 2 occasions when he was prepared to save Agag, a foreign king whom God expressly told him to destroy. And that shows us too how inconsistent selfishness can make us. And just for the other snapshot, just on what selfishness can do, brothers and sisters, is how it influenced his leadership. Because, you know, Saul had very dubious methods of controlling others. I'm sure we all remember the occasion when Saul made a vow that his men were not allowed to eat or rest until he was avenged of his enemies. You see, what he's doing is he's expecting extreme dedication from others, and he overwhelms them, absolutely overwhelms them without any regard of the impact that it has on their own lives. And Jonathan very correctly called him out on it when he said, "My father troubles the land." Just over a few pages, 1 Samuel 22 and verse 7. Just taking this verse where we have Saul, he's speaking to his servants, the Benjamites, and he says in verse 7, "Then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds?" See, what he's doing is Saul's putting the carrot of covetousness in front of his men because that is something that would drive him. And so that's how he's trying to drive his and motivate his men. Now look at verse 8. "That all of you have conspired against me, and there's none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse, and there's none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Me, 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 5 times in one verse." And in this verse, brothers and sisters, not only is he guilt-tripping his men, he's also looking for their pity. Because if he has their pity, he has their everything. Additionally, if you spent the time to go through that verse, you can get it all out of there. He is using falsehoods and outright lying, and he is playing the victim when, of course, he is actually the offender, isn't he? And David is the true victim. This was the leadership, brothers and sisters, his leadership methods of the first king of Israel. That brings us to one of the many confronting conversations that faithful individuals had to have with Saul. Now, we often hear and we often say, do we not, how important communication is. Conversations are an integral part of building relationships. And we want to be very clear right now, brothers and sisters, that a confronting conversation is not about being hostile. It's not about being argumentative. It's not about being aggressive. What it does mean is facing up and dealing with difficult matters. A confronting conversation cannot be driven by emotion. It cannot be born out of anger. It has to have right motivations prompting it. The Latin prefix con means with or in front of. And of course, both conversation and confrontation both begin with that idea of with. And sometimes we might be part of versations. There is no con, there is no with. It's just a totally one-sided conversation. But we can't really call it a conversation. It's a versation. It's not really with anyone else but one person. And likewise, if we go on a tirade against someone, it's not a confronting conversation, it's just a rant. Possibly a railing accusation that even the angels do not do, we read in Jude. We also know, brothers and sisters, and we experience this in life. We experience this in our ecclesias. Sometimes we are faced with what seems like impossible situations, where in our finite vision, we can see no way through the haze and the maze all around us. We see so many obstacles, so many difficulties. You know, certainly with Samuel, with Jonathan, and with David, they all had extremely difficult situations that they faced with Saul. And none of those men were above being in mortal danger from Saul. And yet he is their king. He is the one provided by God based on the people's desire. And so was the anointed of Yahweh. So we just want to talk a little bit about one of the only tools that these faithful men had to try to encourage a change in Saul and thereby a change in their situation. Retaliation is out of the question. Playing Saul's own game is wrong. Prayer and trust is fundamental. What we did as part of our studies, brothers and sisters, is we looked at, we read through the records of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we made a chart of every conversation that was had either with Saul or about Saul. Now you can go through each one of those, every conversation, you can see how many conversations Samuel had with Saul. And you can, it's interesting when you particularly drill in and see what those conversations were like. We can look at every conversation that Jonathan had with his dad, and we looked at every conversation that David had with Saul as well. And what's interesting is Samuel had 2 confronting conversations with Saul. He had many more conversations with him that are recorded for us, but only 2 that were confronting. When we come to Jonathan, Jonathan had various conversations with his dad, but he had 2 confronting conversations with him. And then we come to David. David also had many conversations. You know, like, I can go against Goliath. God was with me when I smote a bear and a lion. I can go against him. Those are all conversations that, you know, David and Saul had together. But when you come to 1 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Samuel chapter 26, there were 2 confronting conversations that David had with Saul. And I wonder, brothers and sisters, in Matthew chapter 18, when the Lord speaks of offense, I wonder how many records he had in mind when he talks about that process of approaching a person and having 2 conversations with them before going to the ecclesia. It's interesting when you consider all those, and you wonder how many other situations are like that. So that was a useful exercise, and we just want to look at the 2 confronting conversations that Samuel had with Saul. The first one is in 1 Samuel chapter 13. We're not going to spend much time on this one. It's quite a bit shorter than the one that Brother Dan read for us from 1 Samuel chapter 15. Just as you turn there to 1 Samuel 13, it's interesting as we consider these conversations. What was this conversation like? You know, how did Samuel approach the conversation? What was his motivation going into the conversation? How did he respond to Saul? So let's look at this first one just very briefly before we spend more time on chapter 15. So 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting at verse 11. The conversation, this is the first confronting conversation between Samuel the prophet and Saul, the first king of Israel. And it begins in verse 11 where Samuel said, "What hast thou done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore, said I, the Philistines will come down now to me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto Yahweh. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of Yahweh thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would Yahweh have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. For Yahweh hath sought him a man after his own heart, and Yahweh hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which Yahweh commanded thee." It's interesting in verse 11, and you may have these marked already, that when Samuel asked Saul what he had done in offering the burnt offering, Saul responded, "I did it because the people were scattered from me, not my fault. I did it because you, Samuel, didn't come within the days appointed, not my fault. I did it, Samuel, because the Philistines gathered themselves together, not my fault." They're all there laid out in verse 11. All the reasons Saul gives for offering the offering that he was not allowed to do. He always had a reason. He always had an excuse for his behavior. And then in verse 12, it says that he forced himself to offer the burnt offering. So again, he's saying, it's not my fault. I didn't want to do it, but you know, Samuel, we're good, upright Christadelphians, and we put God first, right? And shouldn't God receive what is his due? Of course, I didn't want to do it, but I really didn't just have a choice, because I'd rather worship God this way than to not worship him at all. And so human justification goes. And Samuel would have none of it. And we'll see it even more. Let's turn now to this second conversation. So what Brother Dan had read for us is basically that whole conversation in 1 Samuel chapter 15, starting at verse 13 through to the end. And this is, without question, the most comprehensive conversation recorded in the life of Saul. There's 12 interactions between Samuel and Saul as this conversation flows back and forth between these two men. But we'd like to start together at verse 9. 1 Samuel 15, verse 9. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatling and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. A worthwhile exercise to do, brothers and sisters, is to take a color and to highlight in around verse 9. And the reason for that is that throughout this conversation, as we follow it through together, brothers and sisters, Saul is going to mess with the facts. He's going to twist things. He's going to deny some things. He's going to deflect other things. He's going to mix truth with lies, which makes things seem more reasonable. But this verse, verse 9, is the divine narrative of what happened. It's the facts. And it's necessary to have a very clear picture of the facts. Otherwise, we either end up miles away from them, or things become so circular that we don't even know what the facts are anymore. So it's good to have a base, a foundation, and that for Samuel, for us, is verse 9, because verse 9 is the divine standpoint, the facts, the true facts concerning this situation. Also in this verse 9 that we read, the word destroy there, so they were to destroy utterly everything. That word destroy is often translated as devoted. So Saul and the people would not devote the best to God. And of course, that's an echo back to the destruction of Jericho. And it shows us that Saul's sin was very similar, in fact, to Achan's sin, who we all know saw, who coveted, and took for himself items of spoil that were specifically to be dedicated to God. And so God says to Samuel, have a look at verse 10 and 11. Then came the word of Yahweh unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he is turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto Yahweh all night. So this is deeply upsetting for the old prophet. Samuel had formed a relationship with Saul. So much had been invested into the first king of Israel, and now God has made the decision to replace him. But this verse tells us of the spirit in which Samuel approaches this confronting conversation. He does not have a personal vendetta against Saul, but he will approach him as a prophet of God who is prepared to stand unwaveringly for God's ways. And so after a sleepless night, the prophet rises early to meet with the king. Verse 13. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said unto him, Blessed be thou of Yahweh, I have performed the commandment of Yahweh. So the king is the one who opens the conversation, doesn't he? And he opens it with a salutation and a lie. And if you like, just color in that verse 13, I have performed the commandment of Yahweh. And in the same color in verse 11, where God says, Saul hath not performed my commandments. You see how Saul is presenting himself as a total contrast to God's judgment of him. We could, of course, have a long discussion, brothers and sisters, about intentions. Did Saul actually intend to blatantly lie to Samuel, or was it an unintentional byproduct of something else? Well, we leave that to God. Brothers and sisters, we leave that to God. But we do understand the fact that remains that Saul opened with a blatant lie. And so what is Samuel going to do? How is he going to respond to the king? Well, he's going to respond, brothers and sisters, by going back to the undeniable facts. And he says to Saul, then you tell me what I'm hearing in my ears right now. Because that's undeniable facts. What you hear with your ears. And he's hearing the lowing of animals and the bleating of sheep. So Saul answers in verse 15. Saul said, they brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the ox, and to sacrifice unto Yahweh thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. And we see from that verse that Saul immediately deflects to make himself look good, and he shifts the blame to others. So just like in the first confronting conversation, where fault was placed on everywhere but himself, on the Philistines, on the people, on Samuel himself, he does the same thing. And he says in verse 15 here, he says to Samuel, they have brought, or the people spared. And so we see that one of his favorite tactics is to distance himself and shift the blame to others. Whenever he refers to anything questionable, he talks about other people doing it. And whenever he refers to anything commendable, he speaks of himself. This is what selfishness can do to us, brothers and sisters. The desire to uphold reputation and status can cause many another to be thrown under the bus. And this is why we colored in verse 9. We go back to the facts, because God had said, Saul and the people spared Agag. So don't put the blame on others, Saul. I want to briefly talk about what it means to spiritualize something as we have it in the context of this verse. Because what we have in this verse is Saul is taking a clearly disobedient action of keeping alive the best sheep and oxen and trying to turn it into something it is not. When we go back to the facts, back to the divine narrative, we see nothing about the intention to save the best for sacrifices to God. An important note here is, even if there was good intention in this particular case, it was undeniable disobedience. And so what Saul is doing is he's creating a pretense of righteous motives that he knows another cannot judge. And that's using religion for self-interest, using religion for promotion or self-advancement. He was one to use religion as a way to control others. So how will Samuel respond? Have a look at verse 16. Then Samuel said unto Saul, stay, and I will tell thee what Yahweh hath said to me this night. And Saul said to him, say on. So we see that Samuel, he doesn't take the bait, and he stops Saul's excuses. And actually, if you look it up in the ESV, Samuel begins with stop, exclamation mark. Young says desist. And he brings the conversation back around to the important things at hand, which is God's message to Saul. Look at verses 17 through to 19. And Samuel said, when thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and Yahweh anointed thee king over Israel? And Yahweh sent thee on a journey and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of Yahweh, but didst fly upon the spoil and didst evil in the sight of Yahweh? I didn't read how I should have in those verses with the emphasis on the proper pronouns, because in those 3 verses, Samuel says, speaking to Saul, thou, thine, thou, thee, thou. You see, Samuel is making it abundantly clear that he is addressing Saul and Saul's actions and Saul's disobedience, and he does not allow Saul to drag others in. And he decisively cuts through any minimizing or deflection, and he clearly states both Saul's leadership responsibility, and he holds him accountable. And at the same time, brothers and sisters, he also reminds him of a better day when he was little in his own sight. And so he's highlighting Saul's main problem of pride, reputation, and selfishness. It's just interesting, actually, in verse 19, that the only other Hebrew occurrence of the word translated here as fly upon, when it says fly upon the spoil, the only other occurrence of that word in the Hebrew is used actually to describe Nabal's actions to David's messengers. When it talked about Nabal railing on his messengers, it's the only other occurrence. And that word means to swoop upon, to dart greedily. There's actually in a further study, we made a number of comparisons between Nabal and Saul. They were very similar characters. Verse 20 and 21, as we continue in this confronting conversation, Saul then responds back to Samuel, and he says in verse 20, and Saul said unto Samuel, yea, I have obeyed the voice of Yahweh, and have gone the way that Yahweh sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto Yahweh thy God in Gilgal. So Saul is essentially responding with, you're making it look way worse than it is, Samuel. Look at all the good things I've done. He's got his heels dug in. There is no godly confession. There is no true repentance. Because, brothers and sisters, the Saul of the Old Testament is kicking against the pricks. Verse 22 and 23. So now we were back to Samuel, and Samuel was going to respond in verse 22. And Samuel said, hath Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of Yahweh, he hath also rejected thee from being king. And note here, brothers and sisters, that Samuel is very careful. He's not going to get into a tit-for-tat argument with Saul that could go on and on and on. He again, not for the first time, but he again gets to the very crux of the matter. In his book, A Sound Mind, by Brother L.G. Sargent, on the chapter on the mind of Saul. He wrote this short paragraph. In choosing a way of his own and modifying the commandment of God, Saul was a rebel. And this is compared to divination, by which men try to circumvent God in the effort to penetrate the future on their own terms and for their own ends. In pursuing that course and so giving expression to his own self-will, Saul was setting himself against God, and God can brook no rival. And whereas idolatry is the worship of gods that are no gods, stubbornness is a self-worship that sets the nothingness of man against the might of God. It's only at the end of verse 23 that Samuel brings up the consequence for Saul's disobedience. Namely, that because he had rejected the word of Yahweh, Yahweh rejected him from being king. And it's only in the face of this consequence that Saul admits fault. He is essentially making himself the victim. It was the fault of others that he did what he did. He was fearful of the people. They had pressured him into obeying them instead of God. Now, we don't have time to go into it, but for those who are interested in a side study, that is quite interesting and profitable. If you look up the phrase, "I have sinned," you'll find that it occurs 3 times in the book of 1 Samuel, and all 3 times is Saul. He says, "I have sinned." He confesses. And it's interesting that in the 2nd book of Samuel, David 3 times says, "I have sinned." But what is very revealing, brothers and sisters, of a character that is self-focused compared to a character that is God-focused is when you come to their confessions. And you can lay out Saul's 3 confessions side by side with David's 3 confessions side by side, as we have it with that phrase, "I have sinned." You see the difference. And it's a worthwhile study to see that difference, brothers and sisters, and what we really need to be aware of in our lives and for ourselves in our own sins and our own confessions. Anyway, I just throw that out as, for those who are interested. It's an interesting study to complete. Verse 24 and 25. And Saul said unto Samuel, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of Yahweh and thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin, and turn again with me, that I may worship Yahweh." You can see how that Saul is again using religion here. He does not expect Samuel to reject him if he says that he wants to worship Yahweh. But Samuel replies in verse 26, Samuel said unto Saul, "I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh hath rejected thee from being king over Israel." And for Samuel, the conversation is over. He would have loved a true change to take place in Saul. But God had exposed Saul for what he was, and nothing in Saul's communication with Samuel gave him hope of a change in his thinking. And so we see in verse 27, "And as Samuel turned about to go away, Saul laid hold upon the skirt of Samuel's mantle, and it rent. I don't know what you think about that, brothers and sisters, but I see that as Saul reverting now to a level of physical force. That is something that will become the norm for the king, right? You know, pinning people to walls, pretty normal for Saul. We know that clothes don't rip that easily. We know that Saul was a small giant. And then after this incident of chapter 16, the very next incident is 1 Samuel 16, where God tells Samuel to go to Bethlehem. And Samuel says, no, I'm afraid for my life because Saul will kill me. That is where Saul is headed in his mind, in his character. And the Hebrew word there in verse 27 for laid hold of is actually the same word that David will later use when describing to Saul how he killed a lion that was going after his flock. When it says that I caught him by his beard and smote him. That is how Saul caught Samuel, by his raiment. Verse 28 and 29. And Samuel said unto him, Yahweh hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. And also, the strength of Israel will not lie nor repent, for he is not a man that he should repent. We're not going to go there for the sake of time, but you want to jot down in the margin there. Chapter 28, verses 16 to 18, where many years later, when Saul inquired of Samuel through a witch, Samuel tells him words that show the absolute truth that the strength of Israel will not lie or change his mind in this thing, even many years later. Verse 30. Then he said, says Saul, I have sinned, yet honor me now, I pray thee, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and turn again with me that I may worship Yahweh thy God. Now, we don't have time to go into it, and this is part, if you're going to follow that study on your own of comparing the confessions of Saul and David. You know, just ask yourself the question, brothers and sisters. If you say, I have sinned, yet honor me. Honor me? The honor that belongs to God, we seek for ourselves, brothers and sisters. If that is the basis and the motivation for our confession, God will not accept that. It's not about honoring ourselves. But again, I don't want to digress down there. That's another study in itself. But Saul cared more about the consequences to himself than he did about the harm he had done and what it meant to his God. Verse 31, so Samuel turned again after Saul, and Saul worshipped Yahweh. Just two thoughts, brothers and sisters, and perhaps in discussion afterwards, maybe you have some more thoughts. But just on why did Samuel follow Saul after saying he wouldn't? Well, one thought is that he was physically afraid of Saul. I think we've kind of discussed that a bit already. And I think the second option is, or additional point is, that Samuel had an opportunity now to drive the lesson home. And the old prophet did exactly that. he hewed Agag in pieces. And what he is doing in that action, brothers and sisters, is it was an extremely dramatic way to show Saul that words have to be turned into actions. And of course, that we have to be obedient to God. And then verse 34 and 35, then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house to Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and Yahweh repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. So you see, brothers and sisters, God knew Saul. And his righteous judgment was that Saul would be rejected as king and replaced. And God was not going to change from that, because he knew that there would be no real repentance from this man. And here's the difficult thing, brothers and sisters. People had to deal with Saul for many a year to come. Why didn't God just replace Saul then and there? Well, it was a consequence for the whole nation, because they had rejected God and they wanted a king to rule over them, and they were getting what they wanted. So as we wrap things up, brothers and sisters, knowing that there's a lot more to this story, but each and every day, brothers and sisters, we make choices. We make choices of whether we are going to live this day self-centered, or we're going to live this day God-focused. And the question for each of us to ask ourselves in every situation that we face, in our families, at work, in the ecclesia, whose honor am I seeking? And may it be, brothers and sisters, that each of us strive from our hearts to honor our God who is in heaven. Thank you.